This is the Books and Music Show, and we have Gerard again for a wonderful book review. Maybe two, but one that I know for sure. And here we go. I'm going to count the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Who knows? 5 seconds. That disclaimer, they're supposed to be on for 5 seconds. So I think you read it. The opinions and views. I'm not going to read it. Hi, Gerard. Oh, that didn't work. Camera 2. Hold on, we're having technical difficulties. I just have to do that. Is that the first one we're doing?
Yeah.
There you go. That's the name of the book on the Books and Music Review Show. Gerard, take over.
Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction. Today we're going to be talking about, we're going to start by discussing a book that was published in 1980, the early 80s. This was just probably right before Ronald Reagan was reelected in 1984. And it's entitled Amusing Ourselves to Death. It was written by Neil Postman, who was a professor at NYU. And I don't know if you can see the cover, the book jacket, the design, but it's basically
Oh, that was the wrong book. That was somewhere else.
Yeah, but it's basically a photo of a family.
If you put that book where the other book is and remove the other book, I can put the camera on. I think. On camera 1.
Yeah.
Here's that book.
So-
we can see it.
So it's a photo of a family with hollowed out. Actually, they do have arms and legs, but they have no heads. So it's a bunch of disembodied people sitting around on a couch watching a television, and it's a really good metaphor for what the book, the subject of the book, which is essentially how television has mutated the language, how we communicate with each other, and led to a kind of a deadening of the soul, really, of America. Even though that's a bit of an exaggeration, and it's not exclusively television. He explores the history of communication from the oral tradition, communicating with each other orally, and he uses the example of the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer's great poems, and how other people have observed that it's really impossible to imagine that type of poetry after the printing press was created, and how there are certain tools, there's certain mediums that change the way people communicate. The lyrical poetry is handed down orally, is something that would have been that was made obsolete by the printing press, by being able to read a book and impart this knowledge in an entirely revolutionary way. And in the same way, he notes how the telegraph completely upended communication, whereas before you had people communicating in a very linear, coherent way, being able to describe a subject in detail. Now you had these short bursts of news which really didn't have any story, any arc, any narrative arc. so they could come across the telegraph, say an earthquake or a fire, a natural disaster, or an important news event, and there was no there was really no way to sorry, no way for the person on the receiving end to communicate. It was just a nonstop stream of intelligence, and he uses a lot of good examples to describe how television has stunted our ability to communicate. And one of the fascinating observations is a lot of the things people decry now. The fact that there's so much schlock and really kind of mindless entertainment on TV, and they some analysts have said that's what makes television such a wasteful medium. Postman, on the other hand, sees that type of television as probably the best kind of television, in the sense that it's not trying to pretend to be something that it's not. It's not trying to inform you or give you the impression that you're learning something by sitting in front of a television and passively absorbing information. And his dissection of the news media is really interesting. The sense that you have networks presenting you vital information in this kind of bowdlerized way of 3 or 4 minute segments where you don't really have the opportunity to develop an understanding of what's happened. Say a terrorist explodes a bomb somewhere overseas, and you get a lot of very arresting visual imagery of bodies and ambulances and noise, and it has very visceral. You have a very visceral response to that. Emotionally, you're moved, but you don't intellectually. You don't really have any sort of understanding of why that happened, or what preceded the bombing, or the or even in the case of less more pedestrian news, like a crime or something like that. You don't really get any sort of continuity there. It's just a few images meant to affect you emotionally. And Postman acknowledges that even programs that try to give you a more coherent idea of what's happening in the world, even those are kind of diminished by the format, the medium they're delivered in. And he also explores how this affects different aspects of society, because it's pervasive. And he compares some of the religious teachers of the 20th century, the latter half of the 20th century, to pastors and Christian apologists of the 19th century, for example, George Whitefield, or even earlier than that, Jonathan Edwards, would deliver these sermons which required a deep understanding of theology and the basic concepts that were part of a religious tradition, whereas the advent of TV made it turned the religion into almost something that needed to be sowed. And he gives an example of Cardinal O'Connor in St. Patrick's Cathedral during his ordination as a cardinal, putting on a Yankees cap and guffawing with Mayor Koch, and contrast it with the serious nature of these people, the predecessors to these teachers. And another great illustration of this that he brings up is the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where you had two men who were even though Lincoln, for example, wasn't formally trained, he didn't have a master's degree in communications or political science. He and Stephen Douglas still participated in debates that lasted for 3 hours and were predicated on a very structured, very kind of coherent narrative, where they would debate the issue, debate the basis of the Constitution, constitutional principles, and whether the extension of slavery violated these principles. And they would expect the audience of several thousand people to grasp these concepts. And this required a deep knowledge among the people of not just the Constitution, but previous debates about the institution of slavery, and previous political struggles in the United States. Whereas the debates that took place took place after the advent of television, the Kennedy-Nixon debate is a great example where Nixon was assumed to have lost the debate because he had a 5 o'clock shadow, and he appeared he didn't appear telegenic. And this set the example for future presidential debates, where the main objective was not to elicit some kind of understanding among the viewers of complex political issues in foreign policy and domestic policy, but it was more to give a good impression to the potential voters of that candidate based upon how he looked, or how snappy the soundbite was. And in the year that this book was published, that was one of the main things that resonated with the electorate, the snappy comeback that Ronald Reagan had during the debate he had with Walter Mondale, or the "Where's the beef?" quip that Walter Mondale had in response to Gary Hart. None of the candidates had none of the substantive policy points that the candidates made resonated with the American public, and that was by design. The format of the debates were suited to television, a medium which according to Postman, isn't conducive to really understanding deep, complex issues. And some of the chapters he uses get to this point, like the age of show business, which is which describes how Ted Koppel, and this is the perfect example, because Ted Koppel was the anchor of Nightline, where when the Iranian hostage crisis occurred, and that launched his career. Even though this was a program committed to serious news and a more complex view of foreign policy, it was still bracketed by commercials for everyday household products and things that corporations sold you. So it wasn't really, even though it was devoted to public affairs, it was still kind of designed not to have you not get a real understanding of what was important. And I think that's the main theme of Neil Postman's book, the idea that television is harmful in the sense that it doesn't really allow you to allow concepts to settle, for you to if you read a book about say the Civil War, you get an idea of what the underlying concept was, and why the Union and the Confederacy eventually went to war. By contrast, if you just listen to a 30-second or even a 4 or 5 minute news segment about say the Civil War in Liberia, you're not really going to grasp why the country's at war, or what issues actually motivated these people to go to war with one another. And Postman does a great job of tracing the history, how television, in a sense, was the culmination of this. He goes through the disruption that the telegraph produced, the dissection of important subjects into these small staccato bursts of information, and he also describes how advertising, for example, he shows the vast difference between advertising, even though people have always even though there's always been people selling things in a sense. He describes the qualitative difference between selling a horse in colonial era America, where you had a very straightforward, written, factual basis for describing the transaction, and selling the advertising that the late 19th century and 20th century produced, which were filled with pictures and amazing descriptions of all of the things the product would give to you if you purchased it. And that's another theme of the book, this idea that the visual imagery is really has supplanted any type of structured understanding that people had from the days of the printing press all the way up into the advent of the advent of television, and how even radio produced a marked difference in the way people interacted with information. And he describes some of the changes that FM radio and this continuous medium affected in people. And the interesting thing is that Postman lived before he died before the advent of the World Wide Web. He published, I think he published one or two books when the internet was beginning to transform society again. But he wasn't around to see the iPhone or cellular technology completely transform the way people communicate, and he didn't see the way internet technology attenuated people's attention spans even further than the subject of his book, of this book. He wasn't around to see Skype or any of these technologies that really kind of accelerated the process of people being even more I would say even more unable to sit there and absorb a complex kind of linear argument. So, but he still was able to appreciate how over the 20th century the role of this medium had kind of changed and altered the culture. Even things like even other mediums like print, for example. He illustrates it by describing USA Today, which at the time became the second most read daily newspaper by virtue of imitating television. So they used bold, captivating graphics and charts and graphs that were seemingly connected to the news story in question, but really bore no relation to what the article was about. And they were even sewed in boxes that were made to resemble television sets. So even other media, communications media, he described how those were altered by the prevalence of television. And you wonder what he would have thought of the internet, the way that computer technology and mobile technology has really just transformed even further the way that people communicate and the way that people absorb information. And another theme he hits on in the book is the way that people are kind of narcotized into not really, or the way they're kind of narcotized into taking the situation for granted and not really questioning it. And he compares it to a Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, where people took soma in order to, or were given soma by the ruling elite in order to kind of passively accept their condition. And this is other writers have hit upon this theme, the idea that totalitarianism the totalitarianism of the future isn't necessarily going to be something Orwellian where you're being oppressed by a jackbooted thuggish government. It's going to be something that's given to you. It's going to be something that evolves as a result of people being entertained, being given different forms of entertainment by the profusion of media, and that's really what the title is getting at, the idea of amusing ourselves to death, that we're kind of being led into this state where we're just quietly accepting our fate, watching TV and being passive consumers of information. And that's really the main theme, and an explanation of why he entitled it "Amusing Ourselves to Death." I don't know what he would have thought of the World Wide Web and the progression of technology if he had been around today, but I think he definitely wouldn't have been that surprised, to be honest. Anyway, that's just a review again. The book is called "Amusing Ourselves to Death" by Neil Postman. You can pick it up if you're interested in the subject. It's a very fascinating subject, at least I thought so. And if you want to know more about Neil Postman, you can look him up on the web. He was a very prescient in a lot of ways, and a lot of things he looked at. Anyway, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.